free to grab your lunch and hang out with us for the next hour. We have our very own Jon Hainstock. If you're just tuning in, good morning, Jon. How are you?
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Good afternoon again. I know I'm on the morning time, so I'm probably going to keep saying morning.
That's fine.
All right. We'll give people like 30 more seconds maybe, and then we'll kick off. Again, if you're just tuning in, welcome. This is Quiet Lights December AMA, and we're very excited. Okay, we'll kick it off, I think. So once again, sorry for those of you who tuned in right on time. You'll be hearing this for the third or fourth time, but good morning, good afternoon. Welcome. You are tuning in to Quiet Lights December AMA, Things I Wish I Had Known Before Selling My SaaS with Jon Hainstock. So we're going to talk about a ton of stuff this hour. It's going to be a great conversation. You're going to walk away with things like why you should start planning your exit, even if you had never considered doing that before. What's that step-by-step process for selling your SaaS? How do you maintain trust with multiple buyers at once? What does it feel like when you finally sell your SaaS? And so much more. And speaking of more, if you have any questions at any point during this hour, there is a Q&A chat box right at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can click on that, type them in at any point. It can be now, it can be in 30 minutes, and we will make sure we get to your question. Okay, I think that's all the bookkeeping out of the way. For those of you who are not familiar with Quiet Light, I'll give you a quick intro on who we are. So we are entrepreneur-led and focused, meaning all of our advisors have bought, built, or sold their own online business at some point in their past. And we help other entrepreneurs buy, build, and sell their online businesses for 6, 7, 8 figures. A lot of what we do is educational. So AMAs and webinars just like this. We have podcasts, we have blogs, we have articles, tons of other content. So if you're thirsty for more information after this hour, you can head over to quietlight.com and there is tons of materials for you to go through. Okay, let's get to Jon Hainstock, our special guest for today. So Jon is an entrepreneur and an advisor at Quiet Light. His mission is to help the next generation of founders build amazing businesses, and most importantly, to exit on their terms, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about today. He's a self-taught designer and developer, and he built, grew, and ultimately exited from ZoomShift for a life-changing amount of money, which is why we're all here, I think. So hopefully he can tell us the secret behind that. And then he currently lives in Burlington, Wisconsin with his wife and 3 children. And when he's not helping entrepreneurs crush their exit goals, he is hanging out with his family and his kids. He's making pizza and he's playing guitar. So that's Jon. Jon, anything that I missed? Anything else you want to share with everyone today?
No, that's a very, very good intro. Thank you so much.
Amazing. No problem. So once again, for anyone who tuned in late, if you have any questions at any point throughout this hour, that Q&A chat box on your Zoom screen is there for you for the next 60 minutes. Okay, so let's get into it. So Jon, maybe to start, you can give us a little bit of an intro on how you got into being an entrepreneur and owning a SaaS. What led you to that world?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, it was kind of by necessity. So actually, I was working for a tech accelerator company in Milwaukee, which was called 94 Labs, which was the predecessor to the accelerator that exists there today called Generator. And the lead investor there had lost all of his funding. And so the whole thing was getting shut down. And so everybody was let go. I was the last employee standing. I was the last one in the room with my future business partner, Ben. And so him and I started working alongside of each other, trying to figure out what was next. You know, I had just had my oldest daughter, my first child. And so it was kind of out of necessity. It wasn't something that I was like, hey, I'm built for this. I'm dreaming of doing this. I'd done a couple small ventures before, you know, photography business and some stuff like that a little bit. But never really anything at the level of what we were trying to build next, which was a marketing agency, a digital marketing agency, and then ultimately ZoomShift, which my business partner had started as a part of that accelerator program. And it was just something that we ended up building together then as we were able to pay the bills with the agency. So it was out of necessity. It was truly just trying to survive through that period of time where I was trying to figure out what to do. And my options, honestly, at that point were not, I should say, not limited, but they weren't like expansive either. Like I didn't have a ton of options at that point. And so it was very much out of necessity.
That's fascinating. I commend you. I feel like if I was in that stage, I would probably just be in a state of panic.
Well, for sure. Yeah, there was panic. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so you're human. That's
Yeah.
refreshing. So then, as you grew that SaaS, at some point, like I imagine when you started it, you weren't thinking, okay, at some point I'll exit. Maybe you were. How did that thought process come along? Like, at what point were you like, maybe I can sell, and maybe now is the time?
Yeah. So I think most of the founders that I talk with, myself included, during that time period, weren't really focused on the exit. Like we're just focused on the day to day. Like what's it going to take to get the business to the next kind of milestone you set in front of yourself, whether that's like a revenue goal or like a feature or product launch or whatever it is, or a partnership. So our eyes were always kind of focused on what's that next, plateau that we're trying to overcome. And we would talk, me and my business partner would talk about an exit, but it was always so loosely formed. Like those conversations were never really specific. It was like, yeah, eventually it'd be something maybe, but we never really talked hard numbers. We never really talked about what it could potentially look like. So I think it was something that it was on our minds, but it was never really the focal point of where we were headed, right? Like it was never really like a destination for us. It was more like, yeah, we'll get to that after we get to all these other things that we want to do, which is like usually revolving around increasing the revenue and growth and stuff. And so at certain points during the history there, which was over the course of a few years, it was like, well, once we get to this next level of MRR, then we'll start thinking about that. Or once we get through this next launch, then we'll start, maybe thinking about how we could potentially entertain some of these people that have reached out to us. And so it was kind of an afterthought, if I'm honest. Like it was something that we were not really thinking about because we were so focused on getting the company to the next level.
And would you say that because that's something that you probably should have started thinking about sooner, or you?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So, and how would that have changed how you approached your business strategy?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, when I think back, I wish we would have been more specific about what we wanted from the business from the beginning. I think that in our minds, we were going to build this business and keep it running forever, potentially, and have it just be, spitting off millions in revenue, and we could just live off this thing forever and until we die or something. And I think that was kind of the picture that I had in my mind of what it could be like to build a successful internet business. And some of this was like stolen from the guys from 37 Signals, now known as Basecamp, Jason Fried, DHH, and some of the things that I learned from them, which is, build small, build profitable, build this business for like the business that you want to be building and the one that you want to be running indefinitely. And they've done that really well with their company. They've done it for, I don't even know how many years now, like certainly over decades, now. And so I felt like that was probably the route that I would follow. So I think that just knowing that you will inevitably exit at some point, right? Whether you want to move on and do something different, or if like because of outside circumstances. And so to plan ahead for that is something that I feel like would be really wise for founders to do, is to have those conversations with their co-founders if they have them, and to kind of create some sort of a vision for what it could look like to exit. Because if you're not planning for that, you typically can get yourself into a bad spot where you're kind of forced into it. And in some ways, I felt like the exit that we had was a little forced. And so that's something that I would really hope that other people could avoid, Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's like some of those first steps, at least have the conversation, especially if there's other people involved, and have a vision of what that looks like. Are there any other specific tactical things people should consider doing, like related to bookkeeping or other factors that later on you were like, oh, that was a step we should have certainly taken first and foremost?
Yeah, for sure. So let's just kind of like get into like the actual tactics of getting ahead if you actually do want to exit at some point. And so some of the things that came into play with our deal were just like the books. And it actually was a thing in due diligence when they started looking at our accounting. And it was something that we had done on a regular basis, right? We would go in and do our books, our bookkeeping, because we didn't think it was a big deal. But a lot of those things, if you can just hire those out and offload those to people who are really good at them and just staying on top of them, that would be great, because at the time that you want to get those reports for people, you want to have them ready and available. And then, yeah, just doing a good job of documenting like not only the software, but your standard operating procedures. Those types of things can help for sure. Reducing the amount of time that you as an owner are putting in or accounting for that in some way, like having a mental model or even like an actual like financial model for what it would look like to hire folks to take over your day-to-day responsibilities. So these are, I mean, they're kind of common sense in some regard, but a lot of times they are pushed to the last item on the list because you are not thinking in terms of selling. You're thinking in terms of growing. You're thinking in terms of what's the latest fire that we have to take care of, or the latest, campaign that we're running. So anything that you can do to offload some of especially the accounting and bookkeeping portions of those of your business, and making sure that those are really buttoned up well. And trying to get ahead of anything that might come up in legal, because excuse me, in our deal, the biggest thing that slowed our deal down was legal. And so some of these things you can't avoid, but if you can pay for them ahead of time. So in our instance, we actually bought shares back from our initial investor. And so there was some complexity around that, and the way that had gotten done wasn't exactly the cleanest initially. And so we had to kind of go back and redo all this stuff anyways at the point of sale, but it just added a ton of stress into the deal because we were already in contract with the buyer. So getting ahead of that stuff, getting ahead of any of the legal work the one-off legal work that you want to do is huge, because that work, the money that you put into those types of things can actually be added back into the value of your business. And so, getting ahead of those things is huge. Yeah, like I'm trying to think of other things. I mean, so the book, The Exitpreneur by Joe Valley, the founder, one of the founders at Quiet Light, kind of highlights these 4 pillars of value that you look at when you're building your business or trying to prepare your business for sale. Those pillars are risk and growth, transferability, and then I think documentation, which is kind of in line with transferability. So always kind of be thinking about your business through those lenses as you make moves of like, excuse me, like what is this going to signal to a buyer in the future in terms of the risk? Am I mitigating some of the risk for them, or am I adding risk for them? And then there's obviously things that you can do to improve your growth. But like knowing that really like that is what people are looking at when they're trying to value businesses, most likely, unless you're looking for a strategic purchase. We can talk more about that too, strategic purchases. Excuse me.
Yeah, no, I'll buy you some time to have a sip of water. I think that's a lot of what you spoke about. And I didn't mean to blow up your spot with bookkeeping, but I'm glad you're willing to share some of the challenges that you went through when you were selling your SaaS, because I'm sure a lot of folks out there watching can totally relate. And I feel like bookkeeping is a trend that has come up across most webinars and most of these discussions of something that is this afterthought that is so important. If you want to jump into the strategic deals that you were just speaking about, we can dive into that. And then for anyone watching who might have tuned in late, once again, just a reminder, if you have any questions, you're welcome to enter them into the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Okay, so strategic deals, what makes those different?
Yeah, so I think what's really interesting is for us, and excuse me, every SaaS person I talk to, actually just about every business owner I talk to is interested in the idea of a strategic sale, because those are the ones where you get the highest multiple. And you can see multiples that are just crazy. You can see them like 10, 20, 30x. And so the thing I wished I would have known about strategic, and something to keep in your mind as you're considering if you want to sell your business or not, is, or if you're waiting for a strategic purchase to happen, is that a lot of that comes down to timing. And that timing isn't something that, it's not your timing, it's their timing. And so that's 100% out of your control. You can try to prepare your business for it, but there's really nothing you can do. So a strategic purchase might come to you, but they might not actually be interested in moving for the next year or two. And you don't really know, and you can't really control that timeline at all. It has nothing to do with when you're ready. It's just about what, if they're available and if they're willing and able to purchase your business at that time. So that's just something to realize when you look at like, oh, we don't want to sell for the traditional multiples that you might see from, our resources or maybe some of the resources out there. We don't want to sell for those traditional valuation ranges because we've seen these strategic deals happen, and we want to wait for one of those to one of our competitors or something like that. And I think that's like a common thought process. It's just, in reality, those deals don't happen that often. And when they do, they're totally outside of your timing and mostly out of your control. And in a lot of cases, you actually won't get the value that you are looking for from that in terms of the multiple, or the deal is actually totally different. Like you actually get a deal where you get the stock of that company, maybe, and you might not be able to sell those shares for a while. Well, you get very little cash maybe, or something like that. And maybe you have to work there for a couple of years. So there's all these other factors that go into the deal itself, not just the value of, like, not just the multiple. And that's something that I think, like, I for sure got hung up on so much, was just like, what's the multiple? What's the multiple? Versus thinking about the actual deal itself and the structure of the deal. Like, what's the cash? What's the, the earnout or the equity? What's the requirements from me moving forward? How long is this deal going to take? What's, like all these other questions surrounding the deal that I feel like get lost when you just start to focus 100% on the multiple. And I think that's just super common. Like, I know it's very common in the conversations I've had. And the conversations that I was seeking when we were first selling was like, what's the multiple? What's the multiple? Like, I want to get a good multiple. Like, I don't want to leave money on the table. So that's just something to consider, is like, what are the actual terms of the deal when you're looking at strategics, and to know that most of the time they're out of your control. And typically another thing with them is you don't actually have competition that helps drive value for the deal itself. So if you're going to do a strategic and you get really bought into one, potential buyer, and you're all in on that, then it actually gives you, it exposes you to more risk, because then all of your eggs are in this one basket. You don't have competing deals to drive any sort of a better, offer for you. And so it's just something to consider when you're thinking about selling, is to not be so focused on just the multiple itself and having a strategic exit and, something like that. I think it's better to think about what is the deal structure that you're most interested in. And if that is a strategic, we're like, hey, we'd love to be acquired by a company like Twitter or Facebook, because we want to actually be a part of those teams. We want to see what it's like to work in those organizations. We want to, have stock in those companies. That's like a totally different thing than, hey, I want to exit my business because I just want to go do something completely different. I still want to be an entrepreneur, whatever, but just figuring out what your goals are ahead of time, instead of being so fixated on some sort of valuation, multiple, or the idea of being bought by like a strategic startup or something like that.
Well, and since we're talking about different types of deals, whether it be strategic or going after multiple buyers, what about if you receive like M&A interest, and how does that, is that sort of similar to the strategic process? Is that, how do people suss out like these are good folks that we should work with, or this is a really, really bad situation?
Yeah, we got a ton of those emails. I'm sure as your business stays in business, you will start to see a lot of emails from venture capital or buyer brokers, people who are trying to do outreach and stuff like that, which is how we were initially contacted. Um, and what I can say is, if you are in the 6 month to a year kind of mindset in terms of being open to selling, to start taking those calls and to start actually building up your database and figuring out who are the players here, doing your own due diligence on them ahead of time. Questions that you can ask them could be things like, what are some of the other businesses that you've bought recently? What did you see in those businesses that you liked? We're not looking to sell right this moment. We're considering selling in the next whatever months or years or whatever it is. Would it be okay if we, had, quarterly touch points or whatever it is? And the goal there is really just to have some warm leads that at the time that you do get into conversations where maybe you have a letter of intent sent over to you, you can actually get multiple offers. And that's something that we didn't have the time. And part of that was just the way that we were approached, and we'd never gone through this before, of course. But we didn't, like, that's something that I wish we would have had, is competing offers before we actually signed a letter of intent with our buyer. And so if you can keep some of the good ones warm and have, some default like templates in terms of just knocking out any sort of people who are just looking for information, but kind of use those as ways for you to gather information and to make sure that those buyers are serious, then I think you should do that. Keep a good list. That's essentially what a lot of what Quiet Light has done over time, is done due diligence on the buyers themselves too, and have an understanding of what they're looking for, what what some of their purchases have been. And so if you can do that on your own, that's great. And I wouldn't see that as a poor use of time, because if you have competing offers, that can drive up your initial offer significantly. In the case of when we bring deals to the market and we share them with, in our case, like thousands of people, but that you can literally get 200-300 interested folks, and then those offers can drive your initial valuation 2-3 times what you think it was initially. And so without that competition, you can kind of get stuck, and it can really, it's not good for the valuation of your business and what you can actually get for it. So I would say that if you can do it, keep in touch with those people, keep them informed loosely as to like what your plans are, approximately where you're at. You can go through the process of doing NDAs and stuff like that if you'd feel more comfortable, but even just using loose kind of ranges and stuff like that, just to give people a feel without giving away too much detail if you don't have the trust with them. And then doing your own research on them. Like, I think it's definitely worth it, because what you're trying to do essentially is build up your market for when you're going to market, right? You're trying to build up that list of folks that you can hit up at the time that you're going to sell. So yeah, that's what I'd say on trying to like suss those, maybe bad actors out, or even having conversations, is just to start having them and to keep a database and, keep track of them. The other thing you can do is reach out to other entrepreneurs who have like maybe are connected with them, or say like, hey, have you ever, have you ever heard this person before? There's a bunch of, great groups online that you can join, whether they're Slack groups or, communities, right? Discords. And you can just say like, has anybody worked with these folks before? They contacted me. And you can just use the community to kind of also, suss out bad actors too.
Yeah, I imagine that would be difficult once you're already deep into the trenches to sort of have to deal with figuring that out. It's so interesting to hear what you looking back. It sounds so easy. Yeah, do your homework, like duh, but
Right.
obviously easier said than done when you're already on the other side. We have a question from the chat box that I would love to throw to you. Um, is selling a SaaS different than selling a regular online business, or is it the same process? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's relatively same process. So the process goes something like this: like you have some interest from a buyer, they eventually you get excuse me, a letter of intent, and that gets you're kind of under this contract with them, and then you go under due diligence, and then there's a closing, like there's an asset purchase agreement. What I will say is different with SaaS versus, let's say, an e-commerce business, is that with SaaS there is more focus on the technology that you are leveraged on. So people are going to be more interested in your code base. People are going to be interested in all the tools that you rely on. People are going to be interested in, like, is there any proprietary stuff that you are taking advantage of that is or isn't patented, stuff like that. But it's very similar in terms of how people look at your financials and stuff like that. Like, not too much there changes. So yeah, I'm trying to think of like other ways that they'd be different. I mean, with e-commerce, you have inventory that you'd add on to your sale price, in addition to your asset. And then in terms of deal structures, they can kind of range too. So in our case, in our deal structure, we had a holdback, like a percentage of the offer wasn't paid out for a while. And that was to just make sure that like everything would run smoothly for the next few months and that we weren't going to have any sort of legal issues. And that was due to the purchase agreement having some verbiage in there just to try to protect against any sort of legal issues. So I don't think there's like a ton of difference. You might see, excuse me, you might see a difference in valuation, like the actual multiples being higher. But again, a lot of this is contingent on the growth of the business, the stability, meaning like what's the age of the business, how long has it been around, what's its revenue, how many customers, those types of things. But you will probably see higher revenue with a SaaS because of its recurring nature. And so that's one of the beauties of it, is there's recurring nature and the low, like, with an e-commerce business, you have a lot of like additional costs of goods associated. With a SaaS, you don't. It's all, digital. So you can see higher multiples. You can see higher net profits, which then drive up that value of the business overall. Yeah, I don't know if that helps to answer, but those are some of the differences, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, I think to your point, there's a ton of similarities. Like ultimately you're selling a business to someone else, but I think it's helpful to keep in mind that there are some minor things like inventory, et cetera, that you discussed. So thank you for that question. And speaking of, we have another question from the chat box. So thank you guys. And again, we have about a half an hour left. So if you have any other questions, feel free to continue putting them in to the Q&A box. So anyway, we'll get to this one. If you're primarily involved with coding or implementing your stack, how much does that impact the value of your business? So I guess as the business owner, yeah.
That's a good question. It gets back a little bit. I touched on this before, but as much as you can reduce your dependency, like the dependency of having you be the one doing the actual coding, man, my voice just like hit another level it's never hit before. This is crazy, guys. This is insane.
If you need a water break, we're all here for it. Don't worry.
No, it's all good. I feel like I'm all right now. But yeah, no, I think so. And to answer your question as succinctly as possible, try to reduce your your like need for your brain to be involved as much as possible as the architect of this thing. And I know that's really hard. Like in our case with ZoomShift, like 90% of the code base was in my co-founder's head. Like it was just, it wasn't super well documented because it didn't need to be. And so as much as you can do to reduce that dependency, putting as much commenting as possible into your code base, explaining some of the paradigms that you're using, if they're unique, like why you've chosen different paths than others. And this is just going to be important for you as you try to scale your business anyways, because hopefully the goal is for you to build a team and to not be the sole person operating and running the entire code base, because that's just then the single point of failure around all of it. So what I would say is it gets down to really good documentation and trying to include other people into that, so you have a sense for where some of those gaps are. Like you'll start to notice, like when you bring other coders in, oh, this is confusing to me. Like, why is this? Or I changed this one thing and now that like affected all these other things. Those are kind of like yellow and red flags to watch out for when you're looking at your code base for areas to improve and try to bring other people in, or when considering selling in general, like how do I prepare this thing for somebody else to actually take it over? And then how much would how much reasonably would it cost to hire to replace me? And so when you're looking at what the valuation is usually multiplied against, it's usually against sellers' discretionary earnings, which is kind of like your net profit plus any sort of major add backs, like one of your co-founder's salaries, and then any other sort of like things that are more personal development or one-time costs and stuff like that. But in your case, what you'd want to do is to make sure that the salary that you're kind of allotting, for development makes sense. Like it's something that, I mean, even if you're able to do it, do the research ahead of time and figure out what it would cost to replace yourself. So I hope that gives you some ideas. I will say in our case, like we didn't do the best job doing documentation or automated testing. Like, do I think it would have really affected the value of the business or like our actual like walk away? No, but we didn't have competing offers. And so I think that if you're bringing it to market and you have multiple people looking into this, like that's going to matter to different buyers. In our case, our buyers, it just didn't matter as much. But for most buyers, I mean, even for me as a buyer of software, like that kind of matters to me. Like, what is the stack? What, like how updated is it? What's the version that you're using? And what are the dependencies you're using? Like, what is the code clean? And so those are all the types of questions that I would ask when I'm like looking to buy software companies myself. Right. Yeah. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but I feel like there's a ton you can do to prepare for that ahead of time.
I think that's super helpful. I mean, it sounds like if you can't necessarily afford to outsource, at the very least, documenting everything is helpful. And it's going to help you down the road.
Yep.
We have another question from the Q&A chat box. So I'll shoot that to you now. If your SaaS is charging via annual subscription, what are the best deal structures for revenue already collected? If a client pays me last month for an entire year and I sell my business tomorrow, should my asking price be reduced by remaining profit per customer?
Ooh, that's a very specific question.
I was going to say very specific.
Yeah. So traditionally what people do in this scenario to actually try to map it out is they use the annual revenue as they put it on a schedule. And so if you've collected it for, annually, if you're looking at the actual sale value of that, you'd only be charging, or you'd only be counting like the monthly values of those subscriptions for the trailing 12 months. Because like those are the only ones that you've actually as a service provided service for. So if that makes sense, you take your annual subscriptions, your ARR, and you'd figure out like what is the actual value of these on a monthly basis, and you'd add those into your profit and loss statements so that you could track those as monthly instead of annual. Now I have seen this in other deals where they don't, like, especially smaller deals where it's just like, we're just going to take ARR and we're just going to use a multiple of that. That's what actually happened with one of the software companies I just sold. I sold another smaller one and they just used ARR. But honestly, I feel like the buyer probably shouldn't have done that because like it didn't, like they probably overpaid a little bit, honestly. Because like some of the subscription, if it's actually done in annuals, isn't collected, like your service hasn't been provided yet. So look, annual can kind of inflate that number. And what I've seen is I've heard is some people try to like really push for annuals or one-time payments or something, or not one time, but like lifetime kind of subscription things to try to boost the value of the business before they sell. But you're eventually going to have to unravel that in due diligence anyways. So I would just try to calculate an account for that on a trailing 12-month window, because that's usually what you're going to be looking at anyways when you're trying to sell. So trying to get back to the question, take your annuals and map them back to monthly to get a sense for what your actual your monthlies are, and map those back to the actual trailing 12 months to get a more accurate sense of where you're at with your seller's discretionary earnings.
That's great. We love specific questions and very specific answers. So thank you for that. And again, we still have some more time left. So if there are any additional questions, feel free to continue submitting those. So Jon, we've talked a lot about buyers and, when you have multiple buyers. So this might be a little bit more less technical, but when you have multiple buyers and you want to make sure you maintain that trust with them and then you keep their interest, what types of things can you do? I know you've mentioned keeping some warm, but when you're actually sort of getting closer and closer to buying and you have these different people coming to you and you're opening multiple discussions, like, is that stressful? How are you managing all those relationships?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is stressful for sure. I think that you want to try to, in an ideal scenario, you have like a group of those folks that you're emailing or, touching base with on a monthly basis when you're preparing to sell. So that at the time that you're ready for it, and when you're actually trying to receive those offers, if you're doing this on your own, especially, is to keep those folks updated and to make sure that they're still interested. And if they're not, then kind of getting them off your list. But that's how I would approach it. If I were going to try to sell, let's just say I was going to try to sell without a broker or something like that, just based on inbound interest, I would try to keep those folks warm over the next 6 to 12 months as I prepared for sale, and giving them an idea of kind of how the business is trending overall. And you can feel those conversations out in terms of interest and if people are actually going to be able to make a move or not. Questions about financing, like questions about how many deals they're trying to close, questions about what they're looking for in their deals can help you kind of shape those reports. But generally, like, almost treat them like investor reports to a certain degree of, like, you can decide how much you want to disclose, but try to give people a sense for where the business is headed. And that way you can figure out if the interest is and the timing is going to work out, with and hopefully you have a handful of folks at the point that you want to go to market. Yeah.
That's great. We've talked a lot about the process. It happens. You sell your SaaS, and then what? Like, I imagine you celebrate. That's great, of course. But then you sort of have potentially, if you're not, if you haven't been asked to stay on with the business for some period of time, you're sort of a free bird to do whatever you want. So how was that process for you? Like what was it like emotionally when you sold your SaaS, and how did you navigate what came next for you?
Yeah. So when we sold ZoomShift, COVID happened. So we didn't really have a lot of celebration time. But yeah, so navigating the next few months was really interesting. I felt like what was really cool about our deal is that we were able to exit pretty clean. So we didn't have to stick around very long. I think we were only on for like a month or so. And that was just like part-time, just around for questions. They did a really good job taking over. And I thought that was like one of the best parts of the deal. So we were able to kind of unwind and just like take a little bit of a breather. What I'd recommend to people is after that exit, taking a few months to just like decompress, like just let yourself you like just process without jumping back right into things. And so for me, as somebody who likes to build, likes to create, and likes to work, I wanted to start things right away. And so I got real active, trying to build stuff, trying to just get multiple things in motion shortly after. But I feel like even just taking 2 or 3 months of decompression time would have been really helpful for me mentally. And just taking some time to really reflect on just like how the whole thing went and just come to terms with anything that didn't go exactly the way that you wanted, and to be like, look, like can't control, like can't fix it, can't change it. Okay, moving on. You kind of like deal with like the bittersweetness of it, like the good and the bad of it. But yeah, this is getting kind of like like more philosophical than anything, but that's definitely the way that I'd approach it, right? Like decompress, take some time, whatever you got to do, journal, talk to folks, whatever it is. And then come back, and depending on your, what the exit was, and depending on your next move, what I'd say is, and I'm just starting to like really realize this now, is just like, figure out your next thing based on the folks that you want to be around, the people that you want to serve, and doing the best work you can, because that's really, like, let's say you exit for 7, 8, 9 figures, whatever it is, whatever you would consider that life-changing amount of money, where you can kind of like focus a little bit more on purpose and stuff like that, and take that to find the work that's worth working on, right? Like, it doesn't have to be a nonprofit, it could be another business, and if that's totally great if you want to do that. But just remember, the goal of those things is the work. Like, the goal is not just like another massive exit. I mean, it can be, and you should prepare for that, but the goal is to stay in the game and to play the game. And that's like something I've really realized over the past year, is just like, that's the goal for me, at least, is the work, and doing good work, doing hard work, like working with good people, and to realize that you can keep searching and searching for like something else to kind of fill that entrepreneurial itch. But at the end of the day, like the game is the fun part, and just to stay in it however you can, whether that's on the investing side, whether that's what we do on the broker side, and trying to help people exit well, whether that's building more businesses, and just trying to realize that that's the good part, is the good work, and focusing on that. So
that's great. I always love asking that question and chatting with people about it, because I think there's so much weight put on the exit, the process, and then no one talks about the after part. But I think that's the whole point, is to get to the after that, like what happens next.
yep.
So thank you. That's, and I think the decompression is such good advice. Even like when people go from one job to the next, never mind selling their business, it's like, there's always pressure not to take any time off. And it's obviously something that is going to help clear your mind.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think a lot of people don't come to terms with like, just like the good and the bad, right? Like, I think a lot of times you can kind of just bright side it, or, overlook some of the things, but I think it's good to like think about the good and the bad, and really just like process it. And by process it, I just mean like let it go, and then just kind of, are able to move on from it. And then once you feel like you can, just to not be able to not be afraid to pursue things for more reasons than just another massive exit, is something I would say. Is that I think that it's just easy for us to get tied up into this game of like, how do we just make the most money possible, versus how do we do the best work we can in our lifetime. And so that's just something I would say that I feel like I'm just starting to internalize, kind of being, in this almost 2 years post exit.
Yeah. And especially at Quiet Light, it's what we do all day long is help people buy, build, sell, et cetera. So it's like, it seems like it's this daily thing that you do, but the reality is, for the folks actually going through it, it's often a once in a lifetime thing that they do. It's not something that's a 5, 6, 7 time deal in their life.
Yep.
Which is, it's crazy for us to think about, because that's, for us, it's the grind, the daily grind.
For sure.
we chatted before a little bit, and I just wanted to ask you to revisit this topic because I don't think we've talked about it yet, but I found it fascinating. You mentioned that folks might want to under optimize some aspects of their business. And I think that's something that, is sort of not something that I would consider. Like, you would think you want to just make sure everything is the best it can possibly be. So can you speak a little bit what you meant by that? And what aspects should people be considering under optimizing?
Yeah, I think I wrote that initially to you as almost like somewhat of a clickbaity thing, if I'm honest. But I think like thinking about it now, as you say that, one of the things that comes up when when we're talking to folks and when I think back is that the question is, should I do this major change now, or should I wait until after we sell? So the question is, should I run this advertising campaign now, or should I show some major growth and then try to sell? Or should I rebuild my website right now and then try to sell? And so there's a lot of questions around like, what are the major optimizations I can make before selling? And so what I would say to that is, if they're going to shape your revenue, yeah, like absolutely. If you can show good, solid year-over-year growth, and they're not just hacks that are just going to go away. Like I mentioned, the whole idea of just like boosting annuals to kind of inflate your number, or lifetime deals or something like that. But if you feel like there's an under optimization of a strategy that is going to work and is going to improve your overall net profit, absolutely, sure. I think can be some of the under optimized things, or anything that are not revenue related, right? Like, oh, we were going to redesign our website. Like, should we just like reskin it now for them? And I think the answer to me is no. Like, the answer is just like, if it's not going to drive like the actual bottom line of the SDE, seller's discretionary earnings, like I wouldn't worry about it. Like, if it's not going to, there are some cases, like this is nuanced, like everything, where it's like, okay, you're on a platform that is just so old and you've already invested a decent chunk of time and money into this new web upgrade. Let's say your front end, like your marketing site. Okay, fine, like pull the trigger. But I think the whole idea behind the under optimize is around things that aren't going to push the needle in terms of your valuation. And a reskin, like a redesign, to me is not going to really push it. I'm trying to think of other like minor optimizations that you can make. Like just adding a bunch of extra like documentation inside of your code that you just feel like this is going to be the thing that sells my business. I think that there are things there that you can just put off. The documentation is probably a bad example. I would say like the reskin of the website would be one thing, or
like aesthetics and things
right,
like that.
Aesthetics, or like a campaign that you feel like it's just going to artificially inflate. Like you're going to just pile a bunch of money into ads for a small period of time just to try to boost that number when it's not sustainable with your numbers, like your actual like cost of acquisition. I would say don't do that, because like that's just going to nip you in that's going to get you in due diligence. That's kind of what I meant by that, really, is just framing it around the things that are actually going to matter for your exit, like for the actual valuation of your business. But in hindsight, it's probably not the best way to position that. It was a little clickbaity when I sent it over to you.
Well, no, but I think it's still helpful to think about, like, we talk so much about make sure everything is in great shape, your bookkeeping, all these things. And it's okay if not everything is perfect. And I think when people go to sell, they want everything to be perfect so they can get the best deal and they can get the most offers. But the reality is there's diminishing returns is what I'm hearing from you. And that's not worth taking the time and energy to do those things that they're not actually going to pay off.
Yes. Yeah. And it hurts a little bit, right? Because there's some like sunk costs and some of those things that you've already maybe been working on or doing. Like we had some of that for sure. And I think it's okay to hand that to the next person with, and say, like, these are some of the things that we were working on. These are some of the things that we did, and just understand that they might not even ever use them. And that's fine too, because they'll have their own plans of how they want to actually grow the business. And so when somebody's looking to buy your business, they're actually looking at like, what are the growth opportunities? Like, how am I going to grow this thing to the next level? They're looking at it from an investment standpoint too. So yeah, like providing avenues and saying like, these are some stones that like weren't like fully turned over. We think there might be some potential there. We don't want to promise that they're they could work, but here's some strategy that we put around whatever, let's just say, Google ads. And like, we thought we could make it work potentially. We never ran it. Like, okay, that's like great. That's a great like under optimization to like share with somebody and say, here's what we think we could have done. We didn't actually do it. Like maybe you could do it and do it better. Like that is actually an opportunity for an investor who knows Google ads, right? So those types of things can help. It's just any sort of artificially inflating or trying to push up that number, that's just going to erode trust with the buyer eventually. That's just going to come back to bite you in due diligence and make the whole process harder. And that's what really gets stressful is during that period we're getting close to the finish line, you're getting close to the goal, and things start to feel like they're falling apart. That is where it gets super stressful. So yeah, I would just say do whatever you can to build up the trust. And if there are places that you feel like the next person could take over for growth, just understand that that's not necessarily going to boost the value a ton, but it's okay to like not try to deploy every single tactic that you wanted to figure out before selling. Like it's okay to have like a notebook of these things that you were going to try, experiments that you maybe half-heartedly tried, and just pass those along to the next person, because somebody might pick that up and be like, oh, I can actually run this playbook and I've done it before. I've seen it before. I know how to do it better. And that's great because that's a growth opportunity for a buyer. So yeah, that's a long-winded way of answering that question. So I'm sorry about that.
No apologies. It's super helpful. And especially hearing, specific examples is super helpful. We have a follow-up question to this discussion, in the Q&A. So I'll ask it while we're on this topic and then we can wrap up. But if I have made a recent change that I think will help SDE, how long do I need to give it before I can see its value concretely?
That's a good question. I think few months at least. So when we look at the valuation, at least the way we do it here at Quiet Light, and a lot of other folks do this too, is the trailing 12 months. So full years of financials would be great to show like month over month, year over year, month over month, if you know what I mean, like, November last year, November this year, like that's really great. Like that can really help a ton. Having that full year of financials. If you aren't really interested in waiting that long, I would probably give it like 3 to 6 months and just make sure that the numbers look steady, like that there's an actual trajectory to it and it's not just like a blip. So you have some history there. And so the more history that you have there, the more confident the buyer can be that their risk is mitigated a bit. But I get it with people wanting to sell, like, and just to give you some context too, with selling, like the process can take, I mean, in our case, it was like 60, I don't know, over 60 days, over 2 months, and it's pretty common for deals to take a long time. And so just to put that on your radar too, that just make sure that there's an actual trend there, is what I should say. And you can't get a trend off of like a 1 month thing, 2 months. Okay, maybe 3 or 4, it starts to become more clear that this is actually impacting it. And then what you'll notice then is on your trailing 12 month, the more history you have there, obviously the better it looks on your trailing 12 month. So the real answer is it depends, but I feel like a good trend line takes a few months for itself to kind of like actually like be visible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Well, we just have a couple minutes. Maybe you can wrap up quickly we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but I'm not sure we fully covered it. But when exactly is the right time to sell? Obviously, it's subjective. I know for you, it sounds like it was sort of forced upon you in some ways, but for those of us who don't end up in that situation, how do we decide when is the right time to sell?
Yeah. So it gets a little bit back to this previous question, which is I think the best time to sell is when you can show year-over-year growth. Like that to me is the ideal. And so if you're seeing year-over-year growth, month-over-month growth, and your systems are pretty optimized and you're able to remove yourself from the business, you feel like you actually have a good handle on the transferability of it. That from a purely like just numbers standpoint, that's when it's the best time, is as it's growing and you've de-risked it. That said, psychologically, philosophically, however you do it personally, right? Like that's a totally different question. And I would say the time is to sell is before you're burnt out, right? Like before you started, like before that really starts to set in, because the process of selling can be a long period. Like in our case, like our first initial conversation about selling was 2 years before we sold. And then, and this isn't always the case. And if you worked with Quiet Light, or another broker or whatever you did, like that period of time, it wouldn't be 2 years ahead of time, most likely, or a year ahead of time. But 6 months is common. A lot of folks that I'm talking to right now, like, I'm saying like, you probably should wait 6 months to a year, or something like that. So I think that getting ahead of that and knowing yourself enough to realize like when it's time to start taking some chips off the table for yourself personally. And what's really difficult for this, and I know every entrepreneur battles with this, is that we all kind of think the next big thing is right around the corner. Like, oh, once we do this feature launch, now we're going to see whatever, we're just going to see massive growth. And that might be true. And so what's really hard about it is just to come to terms with that psychologically, to understand that like you may leave some money on the table, and that's okay. Like there's never like this perfect situation, unless it comes to you. And some, like, sure, like sometimes those things come to fruition. But what I mean is most of the time when you're planning and you're trying to figure out what the vision is for yourself exiting, like it kind of creeps up on you. And then at the point that you're like burnt out, it's almost too late. Then it's like, I've talked to folks and they're just burnt out, and they can't get rid of their business quick enough. And they don't even have I don't even know if they have the energy to exit it. And that's just like a sad place to be, because in a lot of cases, 50% or more of the actual total money that you're going to make will be on your exit. So you don't want to like flounder that step. You don't want to like have no energy for it, no capacity for it. So prepare ahead of time. Even if you're not quite there, even if you're not totally ready and you want to turn some more stones over, you want to try some more things, great. But start preparing ahead of time. Give yourself a solid 6 months to get your ducks in a row. And yeah, just make sure you don't burn out before before you get to that point.
Yeah, totally. I think I hear that a lot from various advisors, is don't hit the burnout point. And I think it can't be said enough. Well, that's exactly an hour. Wow. This is, Jon, we've never hit the exact 60-minute mark. So this is an impressive milestone. Thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to let folks know how they can reach you if they'd like to contact you after this?
Yeah. So my website is just jonhainstock.com, Jon, no H. And then you can email me, jon@jonhainstock.com. And then I'm on Twitter. I'm not very active there anymore, but they can DM me there. My DMs are open. Yeah. Also just through Quiet Light as well. So I'll be around.
Great. Tons of options. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining and for all of your great questions. We'll be back in January with another AMA and hope to see you there. But in the meantime, have a wonderful holiday season, and